What's up, guys, and welcome back to Bass Fishing Tips. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about fishing a jig in the fall. More specifically, flipping and pitching a jig in the fall for bass. I love fishing a jig. It's one of my favorite ways to catch a fish. Whether you're talking about tiny finesse jigs or big flipping and pitching jigs, there's something about the way that they bite a jig that is just so addicting. It's one of those things, like, we often compare even other bites in bass fishing to a bite on a jig. I always tell people, they ask me, Alex, what's a bite on a coal shad like? I'm like, imagine a jig times 10. That's what it feels like when you get bit on a coal shad. And so if you don't like jig fishing, there's something wrong with you. And if you don't like jig fishing, hopefully this video convinces you guys to pick up a jig this time of year and go and learn to love it as much as I do. Because I know a jig can be a little tricky. A jig is a bait that a lot of people don't have a lot of confidence in. And so hopefully, guys, I can give you some tools to learn and gain some confidence in the jig. And so without any further ado, I'm going to give you guys 3 tips, super sneaky color that I throw this time of year to help you guys to catch more fish. So without any further ado, now let's get into this video. Let's start with tip number 1, and that's going to be fish a shade line. Fishing shade lines this time of year, especially with a jig, really any bait, but especially jig, can be super duper deadly. The reason for that is with all the bait fish and bluegill that move up shallow, obviously the predators are going to follow them. And things like boat docks and trees and different objects that are over the water and hang over the water are going to cast shadows. And as we get later into the fall, those shadows get longer and longer and longer. And those bass use those shadows. The reason they use those shadows is because a bass's eye is a lot more complex than, say, a bait fish or a bluegill. And oftentimes a bass can see bait fish and bluegills when bluegills and bait fish actually can't see them because their eyes aren't complicated enough to pick them out of those dark shade areas. And so instinctually, over probably tens of thousands of years, bass have learned to use shade to their advantage and use shade as an ambush point to get to eat whatever's swimming by their face. And so fishing a jig in those same areas and flipping and pitching a jig around shade lines can be a great way to get bites this time of year, especially when you've got tens of thousands of bait fish and or bluegill that are up shallow. We've got to do something to get those bass to bite. And one of my favorite things to do is, number 1, get them to react, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. But number 2, fish those just big areas, those areas that you go, man, there ought to be a bass sitting there. There probably is. And this time of year, if you'll just put a bait in front of them and you present a bait to them and you present a bait fairly quickly to them, you can get them to bite even though they're surrounded by 10,000 of the real thing. Because I always say one of the hardest bass to catch is a bass that's surrounded by real bait fish. I always use the analogy, why would fat people in the McDonald's eat a plastic burger on the floor when they know the real burgers are right behind the counter? And the only way that we can get them to do that is to trick them into thinking that that's a real burger. And that's what we're doing a lot of the times when we're presenting a jig fairly quickly, dropping it by their face fairly quickly to a bass sitting on a shade line, is we're just tricking their brain into thinking it's the real thing and getting them to react and to bite the jig. The tip number 2 is really kind of going down that same vein of thought of fishing those big areas, but then within that area, what am I looking for? So obviously we've already talked about shade lines, but one of my second favorite things to fish is isolated pieces of cover. So what do I mean by an isolated piece of cover? Well, I'm going to give you an example, a story of where this really played in and where I caught some freaking big fish on a jig during the fall. So all morning long, we've kind of been fishing this sand-ish rock flat that bait fish move up on, and there's just a bunch of bass corralling bait back and forth. Now this sand flat eventually leads into a pocket, and in the back of this pocket, there is an area where I'm guessing there used to be some big trees that got cut down before they flooded out the lake. And there's 5 or 6 big stumps in this area, and each one of these stumps are divided probably by 50 or 60 feet. Each one of them are 50 or 60 feet apart, and these are truly giant stumps. I'm talking these things are like 5-6 foot wide. Truly enormous trees when they were still up. So all morning we have been kind of just fan casting through this area using spinner baits, using choppos, trying to get these bass just to come up and react to our topwaters and different bait fish and things like this, knowing we were going to move into this area. And when we moved into this area, I put down the topwater, put down the spinner bait, and that's when I picked up the jig. Started fishing these isolated pieces of cover with the jig, and each one of those stumps ended up having multiple fish on them. The bass this time of year not only will use the shade lines and use shade as an advantage to them, but they'll also use isolated pieces of cover as an advantage to them as well, because they can set up on those things like a big log or a log jam or a stump, or even like man-made stuff. Like there's people who throw their, sticks and branches and stuff. They just throw them off of the bank into the water right near their house. Those all create areas that those bass can just sit on and use and let the bait fish come to them. A bass is super lazy for the most part. Spotted bass, smallmouth, they'll tend to hunt more and actually go and pursue bait, but largemouth especially will just sit and wait for things to come to them. They're very ambush-like predators, and just like us, if it's just Saturday, college football is on, we don't want to go to the wings. We want the wings to come to us. We get our DoorDash app out, we get the wings to come to the front door so that we don't have to move very far. Bass are the same exact way. They will lock into a piece of cover like that, especially an isolated piece of cover, and they will just sit there and they will wait for those bait fish to come to them. Now, why is the isolation of the piece of cover important? It's because mostly, when you look at a bank, and if there's 10,000 laydowns on a blank, man, you can go and just fish and fish and fish and fish and fish. And I mean, you can spend 20 minutes picking apart one laydown and not get a bite. Where if you have these big isolated pieces of cover, it creates another, again, very just obvious thing that those bass are going to sit on. It's an easy target for us as a human to identify, and literally, like I said before, if you look at it and you go, man, there ought to be a bass sitting there, guess what? There's probably a bass sitting there, especially this time of year, and you're going to be able to flip a jig in there and you're going to be able to get them to bite. Now, going back to my story, we went in there, like I said, caught several fish off of each one of those stumps, and ended up really turning a day around where we had a bunch of blowups, a bunch of misses, and a bunch of fish that were just running through bait fish, and just like the chaos of all of that, we were able to go to those stumps and be able to pick those stumps apart pretty effectively, pretty quickly, and get those bass to bite. Now, this leads me into the third tip, which is make multiple presentations. And this is something that I've done for a long time, but it was really solidified for me one time. I was actually fishing in Oklahoma with Mr. Edwin Evers. You guys probably know who he is. He's used to be Elite Series guy, now he's an MLF guy, probably one of the most successful pro fishermen of all time, and a guy that I get to call my friend, and just a really, really awesome angler. But we were fishing on a small lake in Oklahoma, and Edwin picked up a buzzbait and made the same cast 8 times. And on the 8th time, a 4-pounder come up and smoked it. And it was really fascinating to see him to do that. And I asked him, I said, Edwin, why did you make that presentation so many times? And he kind of goes back to what we've been talking about. He said, I knew there had to be a bass sitting there, and if I made enough cast at it, that eventually that bass would come up and it would react to my bait and it would eat it. And it was just a really kind of fascinating, almost check back to something that I knew was true, but I'd almost forgot about. And just to see that happen really solidified, especially in the fall, and especially when they're surrounded by 1,000 bait fish, and especially when, it's going to be hard to get them to react because they're surrounded by the real thing. Making multiple presentations at something can end up being the difference between actually getting those bass to bite or not. And so, with that jig and going back to those isolated pieces of cover, even those shade lines, but specifically those isolated pieces of cover, and kind of my stump story that I was telling you guys, I would flip in there 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. And what was fascinating is on the first flip, I would get a bass to bite. And then on the 6th or 7th flip, I would get another bass to bite. And so just presenting that bait multiple times in there, eventually it hits the angle, or it moves just the right way that gets those bass to actually want to eat it, and actually trick them into thinking it's not the fake thing, it's the real thing, and getting these bass that I wouldn't say are pressured, but probably overstimulated by everything that's around them to actually react to your bait. It's really, really fascinating. I actually watched this as another great example of this actually working. I was on the lake just a couple days ago, and we got a lot of grass growing in, but there's still these big pockets and holes in the grass. And one of my favorite things to do this time of year is flip those holes with a jig and get those bass to react. And I could literally see a school of 3 or 4 bass, and I think they were just in that grass. They were kind of hunting. They were looking to, ambush bait, and they were using that hole in the grass as that ambush point. Flip the jig in there, and on the first flip, I had a bass react, grab it, I catch him, and then those bass just remain sitting in there. I flip, and I flip, and I flip, and I flip. And each one of the flips, those bass would like aggressively, and they're like looking for it, and they would just lose it. They'd look for it and just lose it. 5th or 6th flips, something about the way that jig hit the water, the way that it fell, something that I did either like on purpose or not on purpose. I'm not going to claim. I'd rather be lucky than good any day of the week. I think I just got lucky. Another bass reacted. And then I did that 3 or 4 more times, and I think I ended up catching 1 more bass out of there. But it's just really amazing that this time of year, how aggressive the bass actually are and how willing they are to actually eat things. It's just something about the way that we've got to present it to them to get them to actually bite it, and that can only happen if we make multiple presentations at these fish, and if we just present them with that bait over and over and over again. And so really keep that in mind this time of year. Fish those shade lines, fish those isolated pieces of cover, fish those big duh areas, but do it really methodically. If you know a bass should be sitting somewhere, flip and pitch at that thing 3, 4, 5, 6 times before you move on to the next piece of cover, because that 5th or 6th flip might be what actually gets those bass to react. And this is really, really true with anything that's going subsurface. I think when we're talking like topwaters, choppos, buzzbaits, Edwin obviously proved me wrong in this thing, but I like to just move. And honestly, that whole entire day we had been moving and grooving. We had the trolling motor on 8, throwing buzzbaits, throwing topwater, stuff like that, just looking for that reaction bite. But on that specific isolated piece of cover, Edwin knew that fish needed to be sitting there, and so he really, really just broke it down, methodically fished it, and got that fish to bite. And it's really, really fascinating. Now, before we get into one of my favorite colors to throw this time of year, I think is really, really sneaky, I kind of just want to talk about one of my favorite jigs to throw this time of year, just so you guys kind of understand what I'm looking for in a good jig. So one of my favorite ones to throw this time of year is the Berkley Power Bait Skirted. This is actually the skipping jig. Now, I really like the skipping jig because it is as effective flipping and pitching as it is skipping. And so it's one of those deals. I like to skip, or I like to flip and pitch this time of year, but I also like to skip. And so having the ability to do both is really, really good. Now, to say that the flipping jig can't skip and the skipping jig can't flip, it's not true. I mean, I've skipped the flipping jig before, but that guitar pick style head on that thing makes it just a little bit easier to skip into places when I am skipping, and so I often choose the skipping jig over the flipping jig for that reason. Another reason I like it is you still get that big 4/0 flipping hook in there, still get that little bit thicker weed guard just so you can get it in and out of cover really, really easy, especially grass cover, and obviously you got the big good hook keeper. I also love this thing because, as you guys can see, it comes with a little bit bulkier skirt, and this time of year I like to fish a little bit bulkier skirt. I mean, you guys can see here, this is like your standard, that's just the flipping jig, a little bit more dainty, and then obviously we get the big skipping jig out, and that skirt is just a little bit thicker. It's actually a double skirt, and so there's that little bit thicker, a little bit bulkier presentation I found this time of year can help me to get just that bigger than average bite, and also it helps it to skip really, really well. But that's the jig that I'm throwing this time of year, and then normally I'll pair it up with some sort of crawl trailer. It just depends. I'll show you the one on our kind of sneaky color here in just a minute, but something like a chigger crawl, crash crawl, even obviously the new Berkley Stank Bug, just something that's got a little bit of kick. It's going to help to slow the fall just a little bit, but not inhibit it and not like really slow it down a ton, is something that I'm going to throw this time of year. Now, when it comes to the sneaky color, this is one, especially flipping and pitching, that I think people overlook because they associate it more with a specific jig technique, and that's all that they use it for, and that is straight white. You know, most people, when you think, jig fishing white, you're going to be throwing a swim jig, and that is correct. But one of my favorite things to throw this time of year is a white flipping and pitching jig. And why not? When you think about Fishing in the fall, we're thinking about tons of bait fish up shallow, and one of the best ways to represent those bait fish is with something white. It's why we throw a white swim jig, it's why we throw a white choppo, it's why we throw a white buzzbait, or doing something to mimic those bait fish. But with a flipping and pitching jig, I cannot tell you guys how many big bass that I have caught flipping and pitching a white jig, and especially big bass. It's weird. I'll go through an area and it's like there's something about white specifically when you're flipping it and pitching it that you kind of cull out some of those smaller fish and you end up just catching those bigger fish. But again, this is that Berkeley skipping jig. This is a 1/2 ounce. Obviously got that white, little bit bulkier skirt. And then I'm pairing that up with a Shape 108 on the back of that one. I like the Shape 108. Number one, because it's one of the few crawls that we have that actually comes in white. Snake bug comes in white too, but I like that Shape 108 because it's got those kind of flange claws. You got that oscillating kick that I like when I'm flipping and pitching a jig, but it doesn't create a ton of drag on the jig and it doesn't slow it down. And I think that that's really important, especially when we're flipping a jig, is you want that thing to fall fast because we're looking to get those bass to react to that bait. Even though we're making multiple presentations, we really don't want to let it soak. We kind of want to flip in there, pump it a couple times, get it out. Flip in there, pump it a couple times and get it out because we want it to fall fast to get those bass to react, and it's just let something that happens, whether it be the angle of the dangle or whatever it is that you do, whether it be on purpose or not, to actually get those bass to react to those things. But especially with white, I think when we got something white like this, I think it is so unnatural and just so bold that if we let it sit on the bottom, we let it soak on the bottom, that they're not going to react or they're not going to bite it. But when it falls fast by their face, it looks like a bait fish. It looks like something trying to flee away, and they're going to want to eat it. But just super sneaky this time of year. Tie on the white. Everybody's going to think, well, you know, what's this guy bed fishing or something like that? No, you're just mimicking all the bait fish up shallow, and you're trying to get that bigger than average bite. But yeah, there you go, guys. That's simply put jig fishing in the fall, flipping and pitching jigs for fall bass. I got a whole nother video I'm going to put out about finesse fishing with a jig during the fall. And if you guys want to see that, make sure and comment down below. And if you guys enjoyed this video, click this video that's popping up right here.